Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. There are two articles in today's newspaper related to India's relations with Sri Lanka. These articles have been published due to the visit of Sri Lanka's Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa to India. We have an article on page number 1 and we have an interview with Mahinda Rajapaksa himself on page number 11. These articles can be very important for our examination because this is Mahinda Rajapaksa's first visit to India after being sworn in as Sri Lanka's Prime Minister recently. See, when we think of India's relations with Sri Lanka, there are two things which come to mind. One, why is Sri Lanka an important neighbor for India? And second, what are the major flashpoints in the relationship? See, Sri Lanka is a very important neighbor for India in South Asia because the country has a significant Tamil population in its northern and eastern provinces, and they share a close bond with the people of Tamil Nadu. And second, Sri Lanka occupies a strategic location in the Indian Ocean region. So for these reasons, India has always given a very high priority for its relations with Sri Lanka. By and large, India and Sri Lanka have shared a cordial relationship and both the countries cooperate in a number of areas. But however, there have been two major flashpoints in the relationship. One flashpoint has been the civil war in Sri Lanka, and the second flashpoint has been the presidency of Mahinda Rajapaksa between the period 2005 to 2015. See, Sri Lanka has gone through a violent ethnic conflict which lasted for nearly 3 decades, and it was fought between the Sinhala Buddhist majority and the Tamil minority. Now, even though the civil war has come to an end, its impact can be felt even today, and it still affects India's relations with Sri Lanka. At the beginning of the civil war, there were allegations of Indian involvement in the civil war. It was alleged that India was supporting and sponsoring the Tamil militant outfits. Then later in 1987, India played the role of mediator between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil rebel groups, especially the LTTE, and it worked out the India-Sri Lanka Peace Accord. As a part of this peace accord, India even deployed the Indian peacekeeping forces, and this Indian involvement again turned out to be highly controversial. And a few years later, in 1991, former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated by LTTE militants. So between the 1980s and 1990s, India's relations with Sri Lanka had become extremely complicated, mainly because of the ethnic conflict. Then later in 2005, when Mahinda Rajapaksa became the president of Sri Lanka, new challenges began to emerge for India due to the rising influence of China under the leadership of Mahinda Rajapaksa. See, Mahinda Rajapaksa's presidency between 2005 and 2015 is noteworthy for two reasons. One, he launched the last phase of the civil war, and second, he gave a prominent role for China in the Indian Ocean region. As soon as he became the president, he launched the last phase of the civil war, which lasted between 2006 and 2009. Even though his government succeeded in bringing down Tamil militancy, Sri Lanka and its armed forces have been accused of committing grave human rights violations against the Tamil minorities during the last phase of the civil war. This matter has even been brought up in front of the UN Human Rights Council. During the last phase of the civil war, China started supplying weapons to Mahinda Rajapaksa's government in order to defeat the Tamil militants, but India was not in a position to do the same due to the fear of hurting Tamil sentiments in Tamil Nadu. It is said that India managed to provide only covert support in the form of sharing intelligence and transferring weapons, but it could never provide complete support like the Chinese were doing. This was because India was sandwiched between two different priorities. On one hand, India had a moral and ethical responsibility to protect and defend the Tamil minorities. And on the other hand, it was a strategic objective for India to counter Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean region. On one hand, India could not ignore the human rights abuses that were reportedly going on in Sri Lanka against innocent Tamil civilians. And on the other hand, India could not support the LTTE as well because it was responsible for the assassination of former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. At the same time, India could not counter China's influence by directly supporting the Mahinda Rajapaksa government due to the fear of hurting Tamil sentiments in India. In the middle of all this, coalition politics in India also had a role to play. During this period, the DMK from Tamil Nadu was a part of the then UPA government, which was a coalition government. The DMK had threatened to pull out from the central government if India extended direct support to Mahinda Rajapaksa's government in its fight against Tamil militants. These were the complexities which prevented India from either supporting the Sri Lankan government or from protecting the Tamil minorities. These circumstances made it impossible for India to defend Sri Lanka at the UNHRC when charges of human rights abuses were brought up against it. So this inability of India was exploited by China, and it not only supported the Sri Lankan government during the last phase of the civil war, but it also effectively defended Sri Lanka at the UNHRC. So as a result, Mahinda Rajapaksa's government tilted towards China, and this was seen as a major strategic loss for India. During this period, China got hold of a number of strategic infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka, including the Hambantota port project, and this was seen as a threat to Indian influence in the region. So that's the reason why the return of Mahinda Rajapaksa, this time as Sri Lanka's Prime Minister, and his first visit to India as Sri Lanka's Prime Minister acquires a lot of significance, considering the complicated relationship that India has shared with Mahinda Rajapaksa. So with this background, let us look at the key issues that were discussed between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Rajapaksa. The most important issue that was brought up by Mahinda Rajapaksa was the issue of debt repayment and infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka. See, with regard to infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka, China definitely managed to gain a lead over India, especially during the presidency of Mahinda Rajapaksa between 2005 and 2015. It managed to get hold of strategic projects such as the Hambantota port in the south, the Matala airport, which is located close to the Hambantota port. China also managed to make significant investments in the strategic ports of Colombo and Trincomalee. During this period, India did manage to make a comeback and partially compete with China by making strategic investments in the northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka, where the Tamil minority population is concentrated. Especially since the civil war came to an end in 2009, India has played a key role in assisting the Sri Lankan government in its reconstruction efforts. As a part of this initiative, India rebuilt the Kake Senturai port and railway lines and highways in the northern and eastern provinces, which had been destroyed during the civil war and the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. India also rebuilt the Palali Air Base in the Jaffna Peninsula, and after the civil war came to an end, India took up an ambitious housing project to rehabilitate the Tamil victims of civil war, and it has successfully built around 50,000 houses in the northern and eastern provinces. But a major breakthrough came for India when Mahinda Rajapaksa lost the elections in 2015 and Maithripala Sirisena became the president between 2015 and 2019. During the presidency of Maithripala Sirisena, India managed to strike new deals, and it proposed to revive the Matala airport, which had been built with Chinese assistance, because the airport had more or less become dysfunctional and non-operational. India also proposed to build oil farms at the Trincomalee port, and it also proposed to build an LNG port and oil terminal near the Colombo port with Japanese assistance. So if you look at the overall scale of investments in Sri Lanka, China's investments clearly outmatches that of India. But despite this, India has a unique advantage, because China's projects in the Indian Ocean is largely pursued on the basis of its economic power and military might. It has been observed that China picks up only strategic projects and it pursues them very aggressively, even though they do not bring any tangible benefits to the host country. For example, if you look at the Hambantota port and the Matala airport, they haven't brought any financial benefits to Sri Lanka. Instead, these projects are a financial burden for Sri Lanka, whereas they bring strategic benefits only to China. See, these investments that are made by India and China, they are not donations given by these countries to Sri Lanka. Instead, they are commercial loans. And strategic experts believe that China deliberately designs the loan structure in such a way that it becomes a debt burden for that country. Experts believe that China deliberately picks up strategic projects which are financially unviable and gives huge loans which end up being a debt burden for the host country. So after a few years, the small country won't be able to repay the debt due to the financial unviability of the strategic project, and this debt burden forces the host country to lease out this strategic project to China for a long period. For example, Sri Lanka was unable to repay the loans for the Hambantota port project. So in order to get rid of this financial liability, Sri Lanka had to lease the Hambantota port to China for a 99-year period. It is said this is how China gains control over strategic projects. And the United States and its Department of Defense and its intelligence agencies have labeled this as debt trap diplomacy of China. In contrast, India's pursuit of infrastructure projects in the region is primarily driven by soft power, and generally India picks up projects which are mutually beneficial to both the countries. For example, if you look at India's housing project, if you look at India's investments in the reconstruction efforts, you will notice that these projects will help the Sri Lankan government as well, and it will also help the Tamil minorities, and ensuring their well-being is a part of India's national interest as well. So these projects are mutually beneficial to both India and Sri Lanka. And when it comes to repayment of such debt, India has generally shown a lot of flexibility towards these small countries. See, right now, Sri Lanka is dealing with a massive debt burden mainly because of excessive borrowing by previous governments. It is said that Sri Lanka's combined external and domestic debt stands at around $60 billion. Most of this money is owed to China, a part of it to India, and another part to other international lenders. So one of the main points of discussion between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Rajapaksa has been the issue of debt repayment of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has requested India to defer the repayment of debt by 3 years. This is expected to reduce Sri Lanka's debt burden, and it will also set an example for China, which is aggressively pursuing debt repayment from Sri Lanka. Then Sri Lanka has also asked India whether it can utilize the $400 million line of credit that India had previously announced for partially repaying the pending debt. See, India had earlier announced a $400 million line of credit, and this was supposed to be used only for infrastructure projects. Later, a part of it, around $50 million, was set aside by India for counter-terrorism cooperation after the Easter Sunday attacks. So this line of credit provided by India was supposed to be used only for infrastructure projects and counter-terrorism efforts. But now, Sri Lanka is requesting India whether this line of credit can be used for repaying a part of its pending debt. Then apart from this, Mahinda Rajapaksa has expressed complete support to ongoing Indian projects such as the housing project in the northern and eastern provinces, the LNG port and the oil terminals that India and Japan are planning to build near the Colombo port. But however, Mahinda Rajapaksa has said that the Trincomalee Port Oil Farm project and the revival of Matala Airport has been rejected by Sri Lanka because these projects were signed by the previous Maithripala Sirisena government with India. According to Mahinda Rajapaksa, the Trincomalee port and the Matala Airport are national assets of Sri Lanka and it should not be given out to a foreign country. Even though he has supported India's involvement in these projects, he has rejected the other projects that the previous government had agreed to. Then Prime Minister Modi has brought up the question of post-war reconciliation. He has called upon Sri Lanka to provide for rehabilitation of displaced Tamils. And he has also requested Sri Lanka to provide for the complete implementation of the 13th Amendment. See, the 13th Amendment to Sri Lanka's constitution was promised under the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord of 1987. One of the key provisions of the peace accord was the complete implementation of the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment provides for the devolution of powers to the northern and eastern provinces where the Tamil minorities are concentrated. It also provides for equal status to the Sinhala language and the Tamil language. After making this commitment under the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord, Sri Lanka established provincial councils in the northern and eastern provinces, and even elections are being held to the provincial councils. And as per the commitment, both Sinhala language and Tamil language were declared as official languages of Sri Lanka. But over the years, the complete devolution of administrative and executive powers to the provincial councils has not been carried out. And of late, attempts are being made in Sri Lanka to sideline the Tamil language by Sinhala Buddhist majority. So that's the reason why India believes that Sri Lanka has never fully implemented the 13th Amendment. So Prime Minister Modi has brought up this issue and he has asked Sri Lanka to provide for the complete implementation of 13th Amendment. Then finally, India and Sri Lanka have discussed the issue of counter-terrorism cooperation in the context of Easter Sunday attacks which took place in 2019. This has to be one of the biggest terror attacks that Sri Lanka has witnessed, and it was carried out by a ISIS-inspired terror module which had links with India. This attack was claimed by a ISIS-inspired terror outfit known as the National Tawheed Jamaat, which has connections in both Sri Lanka and in India. So in the aftermath of these attacks, India and Sri Lanka have stepped up counter-terrorism cooperation. And as I mentioned earlier, India has set aside $50 million out of its line of credit to strengthen the counter-terrorism infrastructure in Sri Lanka. Plus, both the countries have agreed to improve their cooperation with regard to sharing of intelligence. Then, in the interest of promoting maritime security and counter-terrorism efforts in the region, Sri Lanka has requested India to revive and revitalize the Trilateral Maritime Security Cooperation Agreement that was signed between India, Sri Lanka and Maldives in 2011. The Trilateral Maritime Security Cooperation Agreement has created a platform for the national security advisors of the three countries to interact regularly in order to strengthen maritime security and counterterrorism efforts in the region. But of late, this trilateral cooperation had lost its prominence due to political crisis in Maldives and in Sri Lanka. Now that political stability has returned to Maldives and as well as to Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka's Prime Minister has requested India to revive and revitalize this trilateral maritime security agreement. Now let's take up an article from page number 9. This article refers to the development of a new variety of arsenic-resistant rice in West Bengal. This new type of rice has been developed by the Rice Research Station under the West Bengal's Agriculture Department and the National Botanical Research Institute at Lucknow. This new arsenic-resistant rice variety is named as Muktoshri and it is technically referred to as IET 21845. So in this context, let us talk about arsenic contamination in India. See, arsenic is a naturally occurring trace element which is found in rocks, soils, and as well as in groundwater. Consumption of arsenic is considered to be extremely toxic for human beings, and its presence in groundwater leads to groundwater contamination. When such arsenic contaminated groundwater is used for non-drinking purposes, such as cleaning, bathing, etc., it does not affect human beings because arsenic cannot be absorbed through the skin. But when arsenic contaminated groundwater is used for drinking and for growing crops, this toxic element can easily enter the food chain. Regular consumption of arsenic contaminated water leads to a condition known as arsenic poisoning. This leads to a number of life-threatening disorders, including skin cancer. It can cause skin lesions. It can affect the functioning of the kidney, the urinary bladder, lung. It can also cause reproductive disorders and speed up the onset of diabetes and hypertension. Since consuming arsenic contaminated water is dangerous for human health, the World Health Organization has set a permissible limit, which is 0.01 milligram per liter. India also abides by this permissible limit that has been set by the World Health Organization, but it has also set another permissible limit, which is 0.05 milligrams per liter, but this is only in the cases where no other alternative source of water is available. See, arsenic contamination of groundwater occurs naturally, but in the case of India, the problem has become magnified due to the overexploitation of the groundwater table. Arsenic contamination occurs in many locations around the world, but in the Indian subcontinent, India and Bangladesh are the most affected. Within India, severe cases of arsenic contamination is reported in the areas in and around the Gangetic Delta. States such as West Bengal, Bihar and UP are the most affected. In fact, West Bengal is the most affected due to arsenic contamination. Apart from these three states, few parts of Jharkhand, few places in Chhattisgarh, Punjab, Haryana, few parts of Karnataka, and even few places in the northeast also report arsenic contamination. The best ways to overcome arsenic poisoning is by using water from surface water bodies such as lakes and rivers instead of relying upon groundwater table, especially in the areas which report a high occurrence of arsenic contamination. In such areas, we should also promote rainwater harvesting and water conservation in order to reduce the dependency on groundwater. And we can also make use of few water filtration techniques through which arsenic contaminated water can be treated. Latest research has shown that arsenic present in groundwater can easily enter the food chain, especially through paddy crops. So since West Bengal is the most affected state, and since rice is a staple food in the region, the Agriculture Department has developed a new variety of arsenic-resistant rice known as Muktoshri. Studies have shown that this new variety of rice absorbs the least amount of arsenic from soil and water. Now let us take up an article from page number 11 that is related to the topic of women in armed forces. See, around the world, the topic of women in armed forces, especially in combat roles and senior roles, has been a debatable topic. Especially in the case of India, women find it very difficult to enter the armed forces. And even if they manage to enter the armed forces, they find that they do not enjoy the same status as their male counterparts. See, India began inducting women officers into the armed forces since the 1990s. Since then, a lot of progress has been made. Some of them have been even given permanent commission. But even today, most women in the armed forces, they find it difficult to get permanent commission and have been kept out of combat roles and commanding roles. But in this regard, the Indian Navy and the Indian Air Force are more progressive as compared to the Indian Army and the Special Forces. In the Indian Army, women are allowed only in support roles. They are allowed to be doctors, engineers, technicians, etc. But they are not given combat roles and they are not inducted into the infantry and artillery units. The regressive policies of the Indian Army is very evident from the fact that only 3.8% of its personnel are women. But on the other hand, 6% of the personnel in the Indian Navy are women and they have recently been inducted into the role of sailors, maritime reconnaissance pilots, etc. The Indian Air Force does even better and 13% of its personnel are women, and more importantly, they have been inducted into combat roles including fighter pilots and helicopter pilots. Then if you look at the special forces such as the Paracommandos, the Marcos, NSG, etc., women are allowed only in support and training roles. They are not given any combat roles in special forces. And just last year, women have been inducted into the military police as well. Even though India has made some progress in the induction of women into its armed forces, there is still a lot of disparity between the male and the female counterparts. Recently, a petition had come up in front of the Supreme Court questioning this disparity, and in response to this petition, the central government has given a controversial reply. The central government has said that women cannot be given combat roles and commanding roles because they are physically weaker, they are not suitable for command roles. The center has even argued that male counterparts may not obey the commands given by women commanding officers. The center has even raised questions of operational effectiveness if women are given combat roles. And the center has also said that if women are captured by the enemy during conflict, it presents a complex challenge for the government and the society. In fact, this controversial response of the center reminds us of the regressive statements that former Army Chief and current Chief of Defence Staff General Bipin Rawat had made recently. Recently, General Bipin Rawat had been questioned on the lack of induction of women in armed forces and the denial of combat roles to them. To this question, he had said that women cannot be taken into combat roles because they themselves need protection and the Indian society is not yet ready to accept body bags of women. These controversial statements and the response of the central government show the regressive and patriarchal mindset that is prevalent in the establishment. But also remember that this trend is not just limited to India, but it is also seen in armed forces all around the world. In fact, it was only in 2013 that the United States approved the induction of women into all combat roles. The United Kingdom did the same in 2018. See, around the world, there is a general assumption within governments and within armed forces that women are physically and mentally incapable of taking up combat and commanding roles in the armed forces. However, this assumption is not driven by evidence. Instead, it is an indication of the regressive and patriarchal mindset within governments. So, experts have long argued when it comes to the question of women in armed forces, especially in combat roles, that it should be competence and merit which should be the deciding factor and not patriarchal mindsets. There are numerous examples in India and around the world where women have performed exceptionally well in the armed forces, that too under demanding conditions. One of the best examples for this would be the case of Squadron Leader Minty Agarwal. She is a fighter controller in the Indian Air Force and she was a part of the team that guided Wing Commander Abhinandan during the Balkot airstrikes. In recognition of her role during these airstrikes, Squadron Leader Minty Agarwal was awarded the Yudh Seva Medal by the President of India and she became the first woman in India to receive this award. So such examples can help in breaking the regressive mindset. And in response to this controversial reply of the central government, women officers from the Indian Armed Forces have written back to the Supreme Court criticizing the government of India for its regressive patriarchal mindset. Now let's take up an article from page number 11. The Supreme Court has clarified that reservation in promotion in public posts is not a fundamental right. See, Article 16 of the Indian Constitution allows the state to provide for reservation to SCs and STs in the matters of appointment and promotion in public posts. But however, the Supreme Court has clarified that Article 16 Clause 4 and 16 Clause 4A does not confer the individual with a fundamental right to claim reservation in promotion. These articles empower the state to provide for reservation in promotion to SCs and STs only if the state feels that they are not adequately represented with regard to the public services of the government. So this means that deciding upon the inadequacy of representation is a subjective decision that has been left to the government. So providing reservation in promotion in public posts is circumstantial and it has been left to the subjective judgment of the government, and hence it cannot be claimed as a fundamental right according to the Supreme Court. This also means that when government denies reservation in promotion, you cannot claim constitutional remedies under Article 32. In such cases, you cannot claim that your fundamental right has been violated because it was not a fundamental right to begin with. Next, on page number 14, we have an article related to the draft notification of the Environment Ministry, which is seeking to regulate RO filters or reverse osmosis based water filters. But we have covered this topic in detail on the 6th of Feb, so kindly go back and watch this analysis. Now let us take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? Bats are considered as reservoir hosts for numerous viruses including Ebola virus, Nipah virus, coronaviruses, etc. The reason why bats can harbor these viruses without getting affected is simply because they can avoid excessive virus-induced inflammation. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because we have a related article on page number 15. Recently we had discussed how bats act as a natural host for a variety of dangerous pathogens such as the SARS virus, Ebola virus, etc. But the question is, how come these viruses do not affect the bats? The answer to this question lies in the fact that the immune system of bats, which is fighting back the virus, does not cause excessive inflammation, which is primarily responsible for the occurrence of viral diseases amongst other animals and humans. See, whenever an animal or a bird or a human being is hosting a virus, the immediate response of our immune system is to fight back. And while fighting back, the immune response will be so enhanced that it leads to inflammation within the body. And the occurrence of this virus-induced inflammation makes other animals and human beings vulnerable and susceptible to the diseases that are caused by these viruses. But on the other hand, in bats, the immune response does not lead to excessive inflammation. Studies have shown that the messenger RNA of bats is impaired. And this impaired functioning of the messenger RNA dampens the activation of a key protein known as the NLRP3 protein. This reduced activation of the NLRP3 protein is responsible for the reduced inflammation that is seen in bats when their immune system is fighting back against these viruses. This reduced inflammation reduces the occurrence of viral diseases. Now let us take up the second practice question. In which of the following locations have majority of the Rohingyas who fled persecution taken refuge? Have they taken refuge in the Rakhine state, or in Cox's Bazar, or in Chittagong? The correct answer is option C, 2 and 3 only. See, Rakhine state is in Myanmar. This is where the Rohingyas are from. In modern times, Rohingyas have largely settled in the Rakhine state of Myanmar, and this is where they have faced persecution at the hands of radical Buddhists and the Myanmar army. So while fleeing persecution, they have taken refuge in the Cox's Bazar and Chittagong areas of Bangladesh, which is where the Rohingyas were found historically during the medieval period. This question has been asked because we have a related article on page number 16. This article highlights how the Rohingyas have fled the Rakhine state of Myanmar and how they have sought refuge in the Cox's Bazar and Chittagong area of Bangladesh. So in order to help out these refugees and provide basic education to the children of these refugees, the United Nations is working with the government of Bangladesh. Now let us take up the third practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster was the most severe nuclear accident since the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. It is the only other disaster after Chernobyl to be given the level 7 event classification on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The accident was caused by an earthquake and tsunami that struck the nuclear plant in 2011. All the three statements are correct. Option D is the right answer. Now let us take up a map-based question. Which of the following island has been a source of dispute between India and Sri Lanka? The correct answer is option B, the Katchatheevu Island. This is where the Katchatheevu Island is located near Park Strait. Even after gaining independence, the ownership of Katchatheevu Island was undecided, and initially both India and Sri Lanka were laying claim to the Katchatheevu Island. But later in 1974, in the interest of building good relations with Sri Lanka, India recognized the Katchatheevu Island as a part of Sri Lanka's sovereign territory. Between 1974 and 1976, India and Sri Lanka signed a few agreements which recognized Sri Lanka's ownership over the Katchatheevu Island. And since then, India has never raised questions over the ownership of Katchatheevu Island. So right now, it is a resolved dispute. but until 1974-76, it was a standing dispute between India and Sri Lanka. Now let us take up a practice question from the 2015 prelims paper. The Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee is constituted under the Environment Protection Act of 1986. Option C is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: elaborate the plaguing issues in India's relations with Sri Lanka. Write a note on arsenic contamination and its impact. Identify few places in India which are the most affected. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post them in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.